Sorry to again interrupt, but it is time to transition a little bit. I think we learned, well, I know I learned a lot this morning about the intricacies of the connections, right, and of the issue and of the problem. And I think we'll probably learn a little bit more about that, but also learn about that sort of next stage, right? The like, what can we do and how can we do it? How can we build coalitions, et cetera, et cetera. And to do that for us, we have, I guess, traveled across the country, leaving a 4-year-old, I think, and well, actually the 4-year-old is here, but, yeah. And a 3-month, 3 or 4 months?
5 months.
5-month-old. Yeah. As a mother of a 14-month-old child, I thank your wife for letting you come across the country. We have Jesse Hagopian, who is a history teacher at Garfield High School, which, if you recall in the video this morning, was the site of the historic successful boycott of the state standardized test in Washington. Jesse is also an editor with Rethinking Schools magazine, which Stan referenced. Also a founding member of Social Equality Educators, which just sounds good to me, and is also the Black Student Union advisor at Garfield High. We're really excited to have Jesse here, not only due to his family stuff obligations at home, but also because he has very much been making the rounds this past year, frankly, to talk about the historic, successful boycott that he did lead. I'm sure you've seen him on Democracy Now! And other TV stations and radio stations across the country. So we're very honored, and we would love to learn from you. Awesome. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Yeah, I like that. I like that because Quincy Jones went to Garfield High School, who produced Thriller. So getting a little Michael Jackson introduction is appropriate. Thank you to the Advancement Project for bringing me and my 4-year-old out. That was fantastic. I'm really happy to be here because the discussion that happened in the first session is exactly the one that we need to have. And the question that we were left with is, now that we know what's the problem, what's the solution? And I think we found the solution at Garfield High School in Seattle. We won. We scrapped the map. We defeated the standardized test. It was an incredible victory. On May 13th, an email came up at my desk right before the end of the day from the superintendent, who sent an all-district email out saying that next year the MAP test would be optional for high school students in Seattle. And it led to an eruption of applause when I read it out. The students, fist-bumping teachers in the hallway. It was just spontaneous celebration because there had been a lot of low moments where we had no idea what was going to happen. There was a lot of fear and some very dark moments where we didn't know if we'd have jobs because of the action we took against the MAP test. And this was a real victory, but Garfield High School, I think, is no stranger to victory. We have one of the best track teams in the state. Those of you from New York probably get sick of seeing our jazz band come out there and beat everybody. We have Macklemore, who's now platinum, right? Garfield grad with his thrift store hit. So we definitely are no stranger to victory, but this was a different kind of victory. This was a victory for solidarity over fear, right? This was a victory for collaboration over intimidation. This was, I think, a victory for resistance over the scare tactics of the corporate ed reformers. And I think it was a victory for the students who, when I was in Milwaukee speaking recently, I heard that the MAP test scores are printed out in this student school with the students' names and posted in the entryway to the school so the kid at the bottom knows he's ranked the lowest in the school. I think this is a victory for parents who have to clean vomit up off the floor because of the stress that the kids go through before taking these tests. And I think this is really a victory for Rigoberto Ruelas. If you know this educator from Los Angeles, He's a elementary school teacher, never missed a day of work in years, was beloved by his community, and his body was found underneath a bridge because the Los Angeles Times took it upon themselves to publish the test scores of every teacher in the district and rank them, right? And here's a teacher, unbelievable contribution to his community for years, and he's labeled least effective, right? And he couldn't take the public shaming, was too much, right? So this is where our nation has gone, this testing craze, what it's caused to our educators, students, and parents. And at Garfield High School, I got a phone call this past winter, and a teacher called me up and said, we need to talk after school. And I'm the building rep for the union, so I'm used to getting calls and meeting with teachers and helping them through contractual issues or something of that nature. And so didn't think much of it. I went, and right away I come into her room, and she's like peering around the door, you know, sits me down. You're going to want to sit for this, okay? So she looks at me and she says, I'm not giving the MAP test this year. And I wanted to get up on the table and, you know, scream, but I wanted to play it cool. Oh, that's good, okay. Well, what are we going to do? How can I support you? And you know, I'd been organizing against this test for a long time. In 2010, it was introduced to the Seattle Public Schools, and I was part of an effort to pass a resolution in our union saying this was an inappropriate test and that it shouldn't be used to evaluate teachers. And she said, well, I've talked with other teachers that are also opposed to this test. And I said, that's fantastic, because we've had other teachers in Seattle throughout the last few years who have boycotted tests, and they've quickly been reprimanded, suspended, and ultimately pushed out of the school district. And this was a fantastic educator, Mallory Clark, an incredible reading coach, and I didn't want to see her pushed out of Garfield. So I said, we need to get this thing organized and see if we can get as many teachers as we can behind this effort. So we went over the next few weeks, department by department, meeting with all of the teachers at Garfield High School and really listening, right, to their concerns, their thoughts of this test, how it was working or how it wasn't, and collecting that information. And what we found was overwhelming opposition to the test. We heard that the test was not aligned to the curriculum, so that 9th grade algebra teachers are seeing geometry questions on the test, which the teacher informed me would be like if a Spanish teacher sees French questions on the test. Okay, it's foreign language, right? But it's not the same subject. And so you're going to base my evaluation as an educator on something that I'm not teaching in the classroom? That's insane. Right? We heard from the special education teachers that their students are pulled out the most. They have to take this test more often than the rest, which means they're missing class time more often, which means they're falling behind in their classes and, right, being pushed out. The same with English language learners. We heard from teachers who followed the process of how this test was adopted in the Seattle Public Schools. In fact, the former superintendent who brought this test to the Seattle schools also sat on the board of the company that made the test, but did not disclose that when we adopted it in the Seattle Public Schools for $4 million. So the state auditor even had come in and found that to be a conflict of interest. You know, we heard from one teacher in the language arts department, Kit McCormick, an incredible language arts teacher. She had been to a district training downtown, and a district official had admitted to her that this test has a higher margin of error than expected gains at the 9th grade level. And that's from their own, from the testing company and their own admission. This test is statistically invalid for our high school students, but we're going to base teachers' evaluations on it. These were some of the main concerns we heard over and over again. And when we realized that the tested subject departments had overwhelming opposition to this test, we decided to take it a step further. We said this has to be one voice of Garfield High School organized against this test. So we called an all-staff meeting, and we wanted to hear from every teacher in the building, whether in a tested subject of math or reading or not, because we wanted us all to speak with one voice, and we wanted, if the tested subject teachers refused to give it, we didn't want them to be able to use those of us in history, social studies, PE to come in and proctor the test. We weren't going to be used as scabs in that way. So we held this all-staff meeting. It was an incredible moment of my life. Teachers raised really great questions about standardized testing in this meeting. The limitations of it, what would our alternatives be, and I was thankful to have photocopied from Rethinking Schools, Pencils Down chapter about what the alternatives to standardized testing are that I had for every teacher in the room, so they knew that we were going to be pushing an alternative and not just against the MAP test. So that answered that question. But the number one question I got was, well, if we decide not to give it, you're the building rep, what's going to happen to us? What does it say in our contract? And I couldn't sugarcoat it. I told them straight up, if we refuse to give this test, you can be labeled insubordinate, which we have a progressive discipline policy, but in the end, it can mean your termination, losing your livelihood, being suspended without pay. And guess what? Those were not the words that inspired the staff to boycott the test. It was another teacher, an incredible educator, Miss Gunn, who said, I'm tired of having this test label me and my students a failure. And I would rather be reprimanded for standing up for what I believe in than sitting back and letting this test run over our kids one more year. It was electrifying, and I said, okay, it's time to vote. So we put it to a vote right then and there, and it was unanimous. Couple abstentions, but our building spoke with one voice. We called a press conference to announce our decision to refuse to give the MAP test, and ever since then, my life has been in complete chaos. Inundated with emails and letters and books being sent to my box at school from teachers and parents and students around the nation who are sick of these tests governing their lives. People thousands of miles away deciding what should be done in our classrooms. And our resolve was quickly tested, however, because the superintendent sent an all-district email saying, just to clarify, the MAP test is not optional, in case there was any doubt. And this was a real test early on, because now it was official that we had been told to give this test. It wasn't just a clarifying email, it was, if you refuse now, it's officially insubordinate. And this email was sent right before lunch. And lunch bell rings, and the office staff get on the intercom, and they say, all staff are directed to go to the teacher's lounge because a school in Florida has sent us pizza in solidarity with our struggle. And it brought us all right back together to talk about why we had done this in the first place, and the fact that if they're in Florida on the other side of the country know what we're doing, then we can't back down, because this struggle is much bigger than just us. And it gave us the courage to keep fighting. And now the district is in crisis. How are they going to handle this? We got the unanimous vote of the PTA at Garfield High School to support us. We got the unanimous vote of the Garfield High School student body government to support us. So now we have the students, parents, and teachers all united against this test. And the superintendent finally realizes he needs to come and meet with us and try to figure out how to dissolve this situation or figure out some process to make it go away. So he comes to Garfield High School, the lion's den in my estimation, because I went to Garfield High School, graduated from Garfield High School. My mom was a former PTA president there. My brother and sister went there. My dad still teaches dance there after school. I mean, he's coming in to the lion's den. And he comes in with this idea of a several month-long process of a task force where we'll get representatives and we'll figure out what to do then. But until then, you need to continue to give the test. And we said, we're done with this test. We've made that clear, right? What we should do is have a moratorium on the test until any task force recommendations. He didn't go for that. And in fact, he decided to say, if you won't give the test, then we're going to make the administration come and pull the kids out of class and march them down to the computer labs to administer this test anyway around you. And I told him, he was meeting with me and 5 other elected representatives of our boycott at Garfield High School. And I told him point blank, I said, you're at a critical moment in your career, sir. The decisions you make in the next 24 hours are going to seal your fate. You can decide to side with Bill Gates and all of the AstroTurf organizations that he funds that I know have been coming to your office every day saying, deal with this boycott. You've got to put this down. This is a bad example. It's going to spread. You can side with Bill, the Seattle Times editorializing against us. You can side with the wealthy and powerful. Or you can make a decision to side with the unanimous vote of the teachers, parents, and students at Garfield High School. And if you side with us, when I go on CNN next week, I'll let them know we have a leader here in Seattle. I offered him something. I'm sad to say he didn't take me up on that. And in fact, he made the administration come to our classrooms and pull the kids out. And now we were on the defensive. We were in crisis. We had launched this boycott. Everyone's watching. There's this new energy around opposing standardized testing. And was it just going to dissipate now that he gets around our boycott this way? And that's when the active solidarity of the parents and students became the critical decisive factor in us winning this, because hundreds of opt-out letters became streaming into our testing coordinator, Chris McBride's office. And when you have a testing coordinator who is boycotting the test, you got a strong movement. And then the students who didn't have the opt-out letters, well, they just refused to get up when the administration came and told them to leave. Or the ones that did get up and were marched off to the computer lab pressed A in 30 seconds, invalidating the test. So there were almost no valid tests administered at Garfield High School, and the force of parents, students, and teachers uniting for a better vision of what education should be with was proof positive at Garfield High School. Incredible unity is what really got us through that struggle. Students even went with pictures of the lunch counter sit-ins in Greensboro, North Carolina, taped to their back, and went in and occupied the computer lab in our library. Now, they only did it for about 5 minutes because there was no one coming in to take the test because everyone was refusing. So they just got up and left after a while because it was pointless. But you can see the engagement of these kids. And I want to show you very quickly, there's just a 2-minute interview that was done by our union of students right after they were refusing to take the test. So I want to just show you that before I finish the story.
Well, it's been really inspiring to watch the teachers take a stand against this because it really does make a difference.
We want to keep reiterating that the students aren't going to take it. Like, we're not going to take it. Like, not in the literal sense, not in the figurative sense. We need to have this solidarity. We need to have something new.
Some of these kids have been taking the test since 3rd grade now or something. So they've taken it 30-some times. I took it 4 times in my freshman year. And so they have a completely different mentality coming in.
Yesterday was a big day because a lot of people had a choice to opt out of the test. A lot of people didn't really want to take the test. And about the math test, it's really useless.
The assistant principal came in and he told us that since we didn't get an email or a call from our parent that we have to take it. So we went down to the library and they told us either if we could contact our parents right now, which I couldn't because my mom's at work. They told us then we don't have to take it, but otherwise we're forced to take it.
They came and took all of us out the class, a handful of people out the class, and I was one of them. But I was like, wait, no, I opted out. So she was like, okay, we'll still come down there. And I was like, no. So I stayed in class, I sat down in class, and I stayed in class, and we waited for everybody else that was done with the test.
I stayed outside of the computer lab at the board, and I made a decision to not enter.
Yeah.
And that's what happened.
Because I really feel like if it's not a graduation requirement, it's really a waste of time. And so I have no time to waste, especially as a freshman. Because they do say as a freshman, it's harder than a senior, junior, and a sophomore. So I don't really have time to waste, so that's why I really wanted to opt out of the test.
Everyone was talking to each other, everyone was clicking random buttons, doing any, mo. No one really took it serious, and everybody was upset.
I said, Mom, can you please? I said, this is an emergency, and this is very urgent. So can you please opt me out of this test? And she totally agreed. But I had to explain it to her that this has nothing to do with high school.
It's a waste of time. Like, I had a test that's going to affect my real grade, and then I couldn't even take my test because I had to do a stupid math test.
This school isn't going to be perfect all the time. Everything that's happening above you isn't always right.
Look, that's what education is about, right? Those kids are learning something, they're engaged in the world, and their resistance to the test was what made the year a success. And this is freaking out that corporate education reformers. Michelle Rhee, she took it upon herself to write an op-ed in the Seattle Times telling us this was about teachers not wanting to be accountable, right? Why did she write that? Because everything their system is built on is predicated on these test scores. How are they closing 50 schools in Chicago? It's the test scores. Same with Philadelphia. How are they denying kids graduation and then pushing them into prisons? It's the test scores. How are they privatizing education, closing public schools, opening charters? It's the test score. This whole apparatus of corporate education reform rests on reducing the intellectual process of teaching and learning to a single number that they can use to punish parents, students, and teachers. And we denied them the lifeblood of their system, and it drove them absolutely mad. So I think they're really, the biggest fear that they have is that teachers will be listened to, right? And we said we are tired of corporate boards deciding what good assessment is, right? And we asserted the teacher voice in that. And I think in doing so, in my own estimation, this was a big struggle to end the school-to-prison pipeline, right? To end making teaching about a test that makes these kids check out and not see school as a place that represents them and their community, and we know where they can end up. And you saw the students. They're incredibly engaged at Garfield High School right now. And I think they're worried that also we may find out that in fact Garfield High School was not the first school to launch a boycott of the standardized tests. In fact, you could say these boycotts were started by the elite private schools. Let's take Lakeside right down the street from Garfield High School, right up the road where Bill Gates went to high school. They don't use the MAP test at Lakeside. They don't inundate them 3 times a year with the MAP and then 5 other state-mandated standardized tests, because they want their kids to be the next leaders. They want them to think, right? They want these kids to run society. And so they don't have time with dumbing down the curriculum and the standardized tests. And they're worried that what we did at Garfield may point that out, that we want the same for our students that the very wealthy receive for theirs. And this, I want to end on what we won out of this struggle, because as I said, we ended the test for the high schools. We're still fighting to get rid of it on the K-8 level. In fact, the only major study that's been done on the MAP test was done by the Department of Education in Chicago, and it showed that it was not effective in helping student scores in the 4th and 5th grade level. So that test continues, but we have a new atmosphere of collaboration at Garfield High School. Teachers are now getting together and talking with each other in a way that we're usually isolated in our own individual classrooms and so overworked that getting together and talking about best practices doesn't happen nearly enough. And now we have a staff that is constantly collaborating. And in fact, we spent months developing our alternative to the MAP test from teachers all around Seattle, because the boycott spread to 8 other schools in Seattle, which was critical to our victory. And those schools would send representatives to a Tuesday night meeting after a long day at work to figure out what we wanted instead. And we developed guidelines, a teacher work group on assessment developed guidelines for what quality assessment is. And now we're meeting over the summer to develop that assessment that we're going to be using next year instead of the MAP test. We're going to invite the media back in to see what quality assessment looks like, to look at performance-based assessments, the type that people talk about they use in Finland, the type that we use here in our own country when you get a PhD, because at that level, they actually want you to be able to think and analyze, right? So you defend your thesis. You have a thesis, you do research over time, you gather evidence to defend that thesis, and then in front of a panel of experts, you make your case, right? That can be adapted to every grade level and different subjects. And then instead of having everything rest on this one day where maybe your parents split up beforehand, maybe you slept on the street that night, maybe you got in a fight with your friend and you're not focused, right? Instead, we have research over time, right? And we're getting at the skills that we actually need. And so Arne Duncan has called education reform the civil rights movement of our time. And I mean, it's hard to take from a guy who also said that Hurricane Katrina was the best thing that happened to the New Orleans public schools. Right? But he said that, and then he went so far as to call Waiting for Superman, the teacher bashing, union bashing, public education bashing film. He called Waiting for Superman the Rosa Parks moment of our time. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm a history teacher, and I hope I haven't been telling my kids wrong all this time. But I think the civil rights movement started with, wasn't it a boycott? Right? So I think we need to re-examine what a civil rights movement is. I don't think it was started by billionaires making a film. I think it was started by a grassroots effort and a boycott, and that's what I hope that we can bring back in our own time. And it's coming. Education Week ran a story recently where it said, not since the battles over school desegregation has the battle been so intense for education reform and against standardized testing, right? And we saw that our struggle spread to Portland, where Alexia and the students there led a walkout of the Oaks test. And we saw students in Chicago walk out, and parents, teachers, students, and even a superintendent march against the standardized test by 10,000 in Texas, and 8,000 parents opt their students out in Long Island of these tests. We really saw what a lot of people are calling an education spring erupt this past year. And I think it's something that we really want to build on, because we face massive challenges in our society today. We face endless war and over $100,000 a minute being spent to go bomb children in schools halfway around the world rather than fix them here at home. And I taught here in DC for my first 3 years at Henley Elementary School in Southeast, and I know about buildings that need to be fixed. We face an mass incarceration where we have more black men behind bars today than were slaves on plantations in 1850. Right? These are social crises of, sexual violence against women, right? As recently exposed in the military. Economic collapse that is devastating economies around the world and, lowering the opportunities for our students everywhere. And we face climate change that is actually threatening the very future of humanity on this planet, and yet little is being done. And I want to suggest to you all this evening that none of those problems can be solved by bubbling in A, B, C, or D. We have to develop critical thinking and collaboration and empathy and creativity in our classroom if we're going to be able to solve those challenges. We have to reorganize the very purpose of education and then how we assess that purpose. And I'll just end by saying that when I spoke in Portland about this, there was a comment by a parent that really moved me. She's a Latina woman, and her husband was black, and her son came home in the 3rd grade and said, "Mom, I'm tired of being black." And this, she broke down in tears. She can't do anything about that. Her son is facing racism, and she didn't have the tools to explain to him, or it's a difficult subject to broach with your child. How do you explain what's happening to him? And it was one of the worst moments for her. And then he got to his high school, where he had some teachers that took very close care of this child and empowered him and taught African history and taught not just about slavery, but the resistance to slavery, and taught about the civil rights movement. And she said, these teachers taught him to love himself. And yet the school was labeled a failure by the test scores and closed down. And she said, don't tell me that that school is a failure. That taught my son to love himself. And that's what our education needs to be about. Thank you. Thank you. All right.
I feel like he deserves a hug, not a handshake. Thank you again.
Am I taking questions?
I personally have a whole bunch of questions and want to continue to engage with Jesse, but I'd love to open it up for others who may have thoughts, comments, questions for Jesse. I think we have 2 folks. I see you in the back. Our folks should have mics. Roy in the corner, and do we have someone else at the mic? And Hannah in the back corner over there. So please just raise your hand like we did in the morning.
Thank you so much for that, Jesse. I just had 2 questions as you were telling the story at Garfield. What was the stance of the principal? Number 1, and I wanted to know to what level national union leadership stood behind, organized around, or supported your movement locally?
Yeah, good questions. So our principal, I want to keep him at Garfield. So I'll say that he did not do everything in his power to try to disrupt the map test boycott. I think that he saw merit in a lot of the points we were making about how this test was deeply flawed. And I want to thank his vision for that. In terms of the unions, I've never been more proud of my union than when our national president came out and sent a letter of support and said this boycott was the right thing to do. And it really gave confidence to the teachers at Garfield that we weren't out there on our own, that we had real support. And I hope that he builds on that and that the NEA builds on that. And with Common Core coming, we have a whole bunch of standards. And this year we have a whole bunch of tests that are not aligned to those standards. And I think it's a perfect year to launch boycotts across the nation for the very same reasons we did at Garfield. We have a test that we're being evaluated on that are not connected to what we're supposed to teach in the classroom. There couldn't be a bigger opening to refuse to give a test. And I'm with Stan and Monty, who said we should get rid of these tests altogether and fight against ever implementing them. But I think if we take the first step of calling for this moratorium and this boycott, that it will only lead to more activity against these tests in the long run. So if people want to talk about how to organize a boycott in your area or get an opt-out campaign going, this is the work that I'm dedicated to doing and happy to help.
I actually have a comment. I want to applaud you and thank you for coming here and speaking on behalf of the young people in particular that helped work at Garfield High School. And it's right on time because in our conversation at our table and in some of the work that I do, I talk a lot about the Children's March, which happened 50 years ago this May, where in Birmingham, Alabama, children filled jails and ended segregation in Birmingham, Alabama. So it might not have been the Rosa Parks moment, but it definitely kept the movement going.
That's right.
And so I just wanted to let you know that as a child advocate that works with youth leadership and development, that I will tell your story and the story of Garfield High School when I talk about the Children's March.
That's beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you. Hey, Jesse. Question, on the movement building side of things, what are you and your community kind of chewing on now? Like, what are you learning about and thinking about this moment in terms of broader kinds of things? Like, what are you struggling or thinking through, more of the challenge stuff?
Yeah, I mean, the critical piece to winning is having the teachers, parents, and students all organized. And that's going to your PTA and going to the union and getting that alliance is critical. So we're still building that. We're working on the K-8 fight right now because there's 2 schools in Seattle that are still going to be boycotting the MAP test next year, 2 elementary schools, and they're going to need the solidarity and support that we got this year if they're going to stay safe. We were threatened with a 10-day suspension without pay by the superintendent. The only reason why he backed off of that was because we had a flooding of support. I mean, we had a national day of action where he got thousands of phone calls and emails flooding his office, and then an international day of action where the Japanese Teachers Union, the Australian Teachers Union, the Turkish Teachers Union, all, you know, this was, he couldn't, he couldn't deny that. And so this is, we're gonna continue to organize that campaign for the K-8s. But I hope that we're involved in organizing nationally so that if you have a school that's interested in boycotting a test, bring out a Garfield teacher. Come address your staff about how we did it and why we should do it. I hope that the union will help coordinate something like that, or a national month against testing, or maybe the advancement project could be part of an effort like that, or a fair test. We could think about this year, I think, is critical. We've just come off of the education spring, and now we have a year of tests that are not aligned to the Common Core that they're pushing so hard. So this, to me, is a critical moment where they're vulnerable. And they know they're vulnerable because Arne Duncan has even now come out with statements, well, we need a balance of tests. It can't be all. Well, he's getting ready to implement more testing than we've ever seen in our lifetimes as he's saying this, but it reflects the fact that we have a movement, right? And so now is the time to strike. And I think with the resources in this room, we have a lot of people who could go out and launch a new grassroots civil rights movement, and I'm happy to help in any way.
Let me go to the gentleman right here.
Thank you for coming, Jesse. How do you feel about, you mentioned Chicago and Philadelphia. Both of those school districts are facing enormous closures. How do you feel about the students and the teachers standing up in that respect and having testing be a higher priority when they're worried about whether or not they have a job tomorrow?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, first thing I want to say about Chicago is a total inspiration for us in Seattle, seeing them go on strike and stand up to Rahm Emanuel, one of the most politically connected mayors in the country, with the full backing of the establishment there in Chicago, the whole machine geared up to roll over teachers and at public education, and to see teachers reframe the message of students' learning conditions are our working conditions and vice versa, and build community alliances. Because they didn't just start there, they had worked for years against school closures in the past, and they had real connections with parents there. They were able to win that strike, and I think that strike gave us energy to realize you can stand up against this corporate reform movement and you can build alliances with parents, gave us confidence. And then I think our struggle in turn gave them confidence because they began walking out against tests very soon after we did. And so there's been this reciprocal, I think, relationship there. But it's very real, the consequences that can come. And one of the things that I think made us successful at Garfield was not saying, we were very explicit with teachers that if you decide you're going to give the test, we are not going to shame you. We are not going to publicly out you. This, we have to build a community at this school. We have different understandings of what quality education is, and we have different economic situations. So there's some teachers who risked a lot by risking their job, whose houses are underwater, right? Or who are supporting a lot of kids and might not necessarily be able to boycott. So we had to make the space, and by making that space and saying, regardless of your choice, we're going to stand with you, it actually made people more open to joining our cause. And I think that would be some advice I give to teachers in Chicago and around the country facing this.
So, Jesse, I raised a question earlier about, parents of color being involved and students of color. I think students of color are probably doing more than their parents on this issue, quite frankly. But how do we make this, an issue where you have a lot of parents whose, their children go to schools that are, not doing well by the test scores, and they're looking at that as the grade for education, and they want accountability, and so they don't want to be part of this fight against high-stakes testing because that's the way that they think they get accountability. So and you had a number of black students who were involved.
Yeah.
So how do we make that transition to make this a racial justice issue?
That's really great question, and it's the key to winning. There's a lot of different communities that oppose these tests for different reasons, and we have to unite them, and we have to make sure they're working together, and we need to win black parents over to this movement because it's affecting their kids in school some of the most. And I think that's a very real concern the black parents have, right? They want accountability for their kids in school because it was illegal to learn how to read in this country if you were black, right? So, I mean, there were death consequences as a slave for learning how to read. And so having some system in place that is guaranteeing that your kid, or accountability that your kid is making progress towards reading seems natural for a lot of parents of color. When I spoke with Karen Lewis, the president of the Chicago Teachers Union in Chicago, one of the things that I said that I think was able to begin to make inroads with some of the black parents at the church we spoke at was going through the history of standardized testing, though. Where did it come from? It hasn't always been part of the public schools. It has a history. When did it enter the public schools and how? And when you answer those questions, then you know why this can't be the source of emancipation for black kids. Because these tests entered the public schools in the early 1900s as part of the efficiency movement and part of the eugenics movement. Carl Brigham was an open eugenicist, a proud white supremacist who developed the SAT test, right? These tests were these intelligence tests that were first developed in the military and then grafted onto the public schools were intentionally designed to prove white supremacy. And we've seen, ever since that time till today, the same populations score basically the same on the tests. So today they tell us these tests are the tool, the key to closing the achievement gap. But they're the same tests that were developed by eugenicists in the early 1900s, and the same wealthy white populations are doing well on them, and the same mostly minority and low-income students are doing poorly on them. And I think bringing that history back is critical to this conversation. The other critical piece is not just coming to black parents when you need their solidarity, but building genuine movements together with them. And that was the key to the Chicago Teachers Union strike, because CORE had worked for years beforehand fighting against school closures in black neighborhoods, that black parents built that solidarity because they had come and fought for their issue, and they knew that this was not about getting out of accountability. It was about fighting for quality public education. And in Seattle, because we had fought against school closures in the black neighborhoods in 2008, the NAACP had been part of that fight, and they came immediately to Garfield High School's aid and pointed out that the MAP test in Seattle is the gatekeeper to the AP program, Advanced Placement. And so the middle school kids take that test, and if the AP program is overwhelmingly white, then we know that this is part of institutional racism, this test. And so the NAACP held a press conference in support of the MAP test boycott. And so I think that we can make those inroads and we can unite communities. It might be wealthy white suburban parents who want their kids to have the same education that those elite private schools get where they don't use the tests. That might be the reason why they boycott. Or it might be because your kid's school is about to get closed down in the inner city black neighborhood and you need to boycott the test. It might be a whole different range of reasons, but there are so many communities being run over by these tests that if we can speak to them all about the issues they're facing, we can unite them and we can push back this corporate ed reform movement.
Thank you, Jesse. Let me also appreciate you for all you've given us today. And I have less in form of a question as I do a couple of comments. And one is, I believe we assembled here can be the voice of the parents who cannot support their children for reasons of retaliation. They're very, very real in our school systems. Your child gets singled out because you try to stop a movement, start a movement, be involved with that. Not to mention the resources that aren't consistent across our communities. There are those who are much more able and at a lot less risk for doing that. So I can be the parent of the child in Garfield or Atlanta or Mississippi or New York City, and I'm willing, and I hope other people are willing likewise. I don't know why I brought this, but I always bring something, Jesse, and I'd like you to add this if you might be so kind. It's entitled The Perfect Crime. Public education has successfully shifted the blame for failure of schools to meet the needs of minority students onto the shoulders of clients, parents, whom they purport to serve. They have pulled off the perfect crime, for they can never be held accountable since the reason for failure in schools is said to be the fault of poor homes, cultural handicaps, linguistic deficiencies, and deprived neighborhoods. The fact that schools are geared to primarily serve monolingual, white, middle-class, Anglo-Saxon clients is never questioned. And that's by an educational advocate named Louis Arciniga, and he wrote that in 1970. Thank you again.
Thank you. Yeah, right on.
Are there any other questions or comments? Well, with that, I want to thank you again for coming. Really, Thank you again so much. So we have reached the point of the program where we can eat. So there are some lunches. If you go right out either door, you go to the left. We encourage you all to come back here and sit amongst friends and new folks as well. We're going to have a little time just to sort of eat. We want to make sure people can just eat. And then we are, by 1, we are going to start with a spoken word performance and then continue some of those conversations that folks had earlier before leading into another panel.